The stagecoach rattled into Sierra City, California on a dusty September afternoon in 1877, and Natalie Lawrence pressed her gloved hand against the window, heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst right through her corset. 6 months of letters had brought her across the entire country to meet Samuel Ellis, the rancher whose words had captured her soul long before she ever saw his face. She clutched his most recent letter in her lap, the paper soft from being read and reread until the creases threatened to tear. His handwriting was deliberate and clean, each word chosen with care that made her chest ache. He had written about the ranch he was building, about the mountains that turned purple at sunset, about how lonely the evenings were without someone to share them with. But more than that, he had written about his dreams, his fears, his hopes for a life that mattered. And somewhere between the third and fourth letter, Natalie had realized she was falling in love with a man she had never met. The stage lurched to a stop outside the general store, dust swirling around the wheels. Natalie took a shaky breath and smoothed her traveling dress, a deep green fabric that her sister had assured her brought out her eyes. At 22, she had never been called a beauty, but her auburn hair caught the light nicely when she remembered to brush it, and her freckles gave her a youthful appearance that some men found appealing. She hoped Samuel would be one of them. The driver opened the door and offered his hand. "Here we are, miss. Sierra City, such as it is." Natalie stepped down onto the wooden boardwalk, her legs unsteady after days of travel. The town was smaller than she had imagined, just a single main street lined with false-fronted buildings. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and she raised a hand to shield her eyes as she scanned the handful of people moving about their business. "Miss Lawrence." The voice came from behind her, deep and uncertain. Natalie turned and found herself looking up at a man who took her breath away completely. Samuel Ellis stood 6 feet tall with broad shoulders that spoke of hard work rather than idle strength. His dark hair was neatly trimmed beneath a worn hat, and his blue eyes held an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she never had before. He was handsome, devastatingly so, but it was the vulnerability in his expression that made her heart skip. He looked as nervous as she felt. "Mr. Ellis," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Samuel, please." He removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "I had hoped I would recognize you from your description, but you did not do yourself justice. You are much lovelier than I imagined." Heat flooded Natalie's cheeks. "And you are exactly as I pictured you. Your letters painted such a clear image that I feel I already know you." Something shifted in his expression, a tension releasing from his shoulders. "I had worried that perhaps I wrote too much, revealed too much of myself too quickly. My brother said I should have been more reserved, but I could not seem to help it. Once I started writing to you, the words just poured out. I am glad they did." Natalie stepped closer, clutching her small travel bag. "I felt the same way. Every letter I sent felt like I was giving you another piece of my heart, and I was terrified you might not want it." Samuel's eyes widened. "Not want it? Miss Lawrence, Natalie, I have spent the last 3 months counting the days until your arrival. Your letters have been the brightest part of my life. I know we agreed this would be a marriage of convenience, a practical arrangement, but I must confess something to you right now, before we go any further." Natalie's breath caught. "What is it?" "I am already in love with you." The words tumbled out in a rush, as if he had been holding them back too long. "I know that might frighten you, and I understand if you need time, but I could not let you think this was just a business arrangement for me. It stopped being that somewhere around your second letter when you wrote about your mother's garden and how you could still smell the roses when you closed your eyes. I have been lost ever since." Tears sprang to Natalie's eyes and she laughed, a sound of pure joy that drew curious glances from passers-by. "Samuel, I came here already loving you. I told myself I was being foolish, that you could not really know someone through letters, but I knew. I knew from the moment you wrote about sitting on your porch watching the stars and wishing you had someone to share the beauty with. I wanted to be that person more than I have ever wanted anything." Samuel stared at her for a long moment, his eyes shining. Then, right there on the main street of Sierra City with half the town watching, he reached out and took her hand. "We are going to be very happy together, Natalie Lawrence." "Soon to be Natalie Ellis," she said, and his smile could have lit up the entire valley. The next hour passed in a blur. Samuel retrieved her trunk from the stagecoach, settling her bill with the driver while she waited, still feeling as if she were floating above the ground. He loaded her belongings into a sturdy wagon, then helped her up onto the bench seat with a gentleness that made her heart flutter. "The ranch is about 5 miles out of town," he explained as he climbed up beside her and took the reins. "It is not much yet, just a small house and barn, but the land is good. I have been building up the herd slowly, making sure I do it right. I want to give you a real home, Natalie, not just a structure with walls." "I am sure I will love it," she assured him, and she meant it. She would have been happy in a tent if it meant being with him. As they rode out of town, Samuel pointed out landmarks and shared stories about his neighbors. The Hendersons ran cattle on the adjoining property and had been helpful when he first arrived. Old Jim Potter ran the livery stable and knew everything about everyone in the county. The banker, Mr. Thornton, was fair but stern, and the minister, Reverend Walsh, was a kind man who had helped Samuel frame his house last winter. "They are all eager to meet you," Samuel said. "A single man arriving from Missouri caused enough talk, but when word got out that I was bringing a bride from Boston, well, you have been the primary topic of conversation for weeks." Natalie bit her lip. "I hope I do not disappoint them." "Impossible." Samuel glanced at her, his expression soft. "But I want you to know that you do not have to prove anything to anyone. You are here for me, not for them. If Sierra City does not suit you, if you find it too rough or too lonely, we can go somewhere else. I chose this place because the land called to me, but you are more important than any piece of ground." "Samuel, I appreciate that, but I did not come all this way planning to turn around and leave. I want to build a life here with you. I want to see those purple mountains you wrote about. I want to help you make this ranch everything you dream it can be." He pulled the wagon to a stop right there in the middle of the dusty road and turned to face her fully. "I need you to understand something. I am not a wealthy man. I have land and prospects, but the next few years will be hard work. There will be lean times and difficulties. I cannot promise you an easy life." "I do not want an easy life," Natalie said firmly. "I want a meaningful one." In Boston, I was suffocating in my aunt's parlor, pouring tea for her friends and pretending to care about gossip and social climbing. When my parents died 3 years ago, I moved in with her because I had nowhere else to go, but every day felt empty. Your letters offered me purpose, Samuel. They offered me partnership and respect and love. That is worth more than all the comfort in the world. Samuel reached out slowly, as if afraid she might disappear, and cupped her face in his work-roughened hand. "How did I get so lucky?" "I ask myself the same question," she whispered. They sat there for a long moment, the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders and the mountains rising in the distance. Then Samuel released her with visible reluctance and urged the horses forward again. The ranch came into view as they crested a small rise, and Natalie caught her breath. It was modest but beautiful, a wooden house with a covered porch sitting in a valley surrounded by rolling hills. A barn stood nearby, freshly painted, and she could see cattle grazing in a fenced pasture. A creek wound through the property, lined with cottonwood trees that were just beginning to turn gold with the approach of autumn. "It is perfect," she breathed. Samuel helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering on her waist. "Come inside. I have been preparing for weeks." The house was small but well built, with 2 rooms downstairs and a loft above. Samuel had clearly worked hard to make it welcoming. The wooden floors were swept clean and wildflowers sat in a jar on the kitchen table. The furniture was simple but sturdy, much of it handmade. Everything was neat and organized, though she could see the nervous touches. A crooked picture frame straightened one too many times, dishes arranged just so on the shelf. "I know it is not what you are used to," Samuel began, but Natalie cut him off. "It is wonderful because it is yours." "Ours," she corrected, and watched his face light up. "There is a spare room through there," he said, pointing to a door off the main living area. "I thought you might want your own space until after the wedding. I know this has all happened very quickly, and I want you to feel comfortable." Natalie's heart swelled at his consideration. "When is the wedding?" "Reverend Walsh can perform the ceremony whenever we are ready. I thought perhaps in a few days, to give you time to settle in and make sure you still want to go through with it." "I want to go through with it," Natalie said immediately. "But a few days to prepare sounds wise. I would like to make a proper dress and perhaps get to know you in person as well as I feel I know you from your letters." Samuel smiled. "I would like that very much." "I want to court you properly, Natalie, even if we are doing everything slightly backward." Over the next 3 days, Samuel did exactly that. He showed her around the ranch, teaching her about the cattle and the land. He introduced her to the horses, including a gentle mare named Willow that he said could be hers. They walked along the creek in the evenings, talking for hours about everything and nothing, filling in the gaps that letters could not cover. Natalie learned that Samuel was 26 and had come west after his parents died in a fire 2 years ago. He had worked on various ranches across Missouri and Kansas before finding this property and deciding to put down roots. He was patient and thoughtful, slow to anger but passionate about the things he cared for. He loved the land with a fierce devotion that matched her own feelings about the written word. In turn, she told him about growing up in Boston, about her father who had been a professor of literature and her mother who had filled their home with music. She spoke of the loneliness after they died, of feeling trapped in a life that did not fit, of the courage it had taken to answer his advertisement in the newspaper. "I was terrified," she admitted as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple, just as he had described. "What if you were cruel? What if your letters had been lies? What if I arrived and you took one look at me and sent me back?" "Never," Samuel said fiercely. He took her hand, no longer asking permission for the small touches that had become natural between them. "Even if there had been no spark between us, I would never have been so dishonorable. But Natalie, I felt it the moment I saw you. Everything I hoped for, everything I dreamed about while reading your letters, it was all there in your eyes." Natalie turned to him, her heart full to bursting. "Samuel, I do not want to wait any longer. Let us get married tomorrow, I am already sure." His eyes searched hers. "Are you certain?" "I have never been more certain of anything." The next morning they rode into Sierra City together. The town was abuzz with curiosity about the mail-order bride, and Natalie felt dozens of eyes watching as Samuel helped her down from the wagon outside the small church. She wore her best dress, a pale blue silk that had been her mother's, and carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Samuel had picked at dawn. Reverend Walsh was a kindly man in his 50s who seemed genuinely pleased to officiate the ceremony. A few townspeople had gathered, curious and friendly, and Mrs. Henderson from the neighboring ranch had offered to stand as witness along with her husband. The ceremony itself was simple but profound. Natalie's voice shook as she said her vows, and she saw tears in Samuel's eyes as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. When the reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed her with a gentleness that made her want to weep. This was real. This was her life now. The Hendersons invited them for a celebratory dinner, and Natalie found herself surrounded by warm, welcoming people who were genuinely happy for them. Mrs. Henderson, a weathered woman with kind eyes, pulled her aside at one point. "I see the way he looks at you," she said quietly. "That boy has been lonely since he arrived, though he is too proud to say so. You are good for him, and from what I can see, he is good for you too." "He is everything I hoped for," Natalie confessed. "Is that foolish? We have only known each other a few days." "Love does not operate on a schedule," Mrs. Henderson said with a smile. "My husband proposed after knowing me for 2 weeks, and we have been married 30 years. When you know, you know." As the sun began to set, Samuel and Natalie made their excuses and headed back to the ranch. The ride home was quiet but comfortable, their hands linked between them on the wagon seat. Natalie felt nervous excitement building in her chest, wondering what the night would bring. Samuel seemed to sense her nerves. As he helped her down from the wagon, he said gently, "We do not have to rush anything, Natalie. I meant what I said about wanting you to be comfortable." "I am comfortable with you," she said truthfully. "But I am also nervous. Is that strange?" "Not at all. I am nervous too," he smiled ruefully. "I keep worrying that I will wake up and discover this was all a dream, that you are not really here, that I am still alone writing letters to a woman I will never meet." Natalie reached up and touched his face, feeling the slight stubble on his jaw. "I am real. This is real. And I love you, Samuel Ellis. I loved you before I met you, and I love you more now that I know you in the flesh." "I love you too," he whispered, and kissed her again, deeper this time with a passion that had been carefully restrained over the past few days. They made their way inside, and Samuel lit the lamps while Natalie stood uncertainly in the middle of the room. He came to her and took her hands, his expression serious. "I want you to know that you are safe with me always. You are my wife, my partner, my equal. Not my property, not my servant. If you ever need anything, if I ever do anything that troubles you, I want you to tell me. Promise me that." "I promise," Natalie said, moved by his words. "And the same goes for you. I want us to be honest with each other always." "Always," he agreed. That night, they came together as husband and wife, and it was everything Natalie had hoped for, tender and passionate, awkward and perfect all at once. Samuel was patient and careful, ensuring her comfort above his own pleasure, and when they finally lay tangled together in the moonlight streaming through the window, Natalie felt a sense of completeness she had never known before. "I used to think love was something that grew slowly over years," she murmured, her head on his chest. "But I think maybe it can also strike like lightning, fast and fierce and impossible to deny." "Like recognizing like," Samuel said, his fingers trailing through her hair. "I think our souls knew each other before we did." The first weeks of marriage were an adjustment, but a joyful one. Natalie learned the rhythms of ranch life, discovering talents she never knew she had. She could ride well enough after a few lessons from Samuel, and she had a knack for managing the household finances that he gratefully turned over to her. She started a garden near the house, using seeds that Mrs. Henderson had shared, and spent her evenings writing letters to her sister back in Boston, describing her new life in glowing terms. Samuel was an attentive husband, always making sure she felt included in decisions about the ranch. He taught her to shoot, insisting that she needed to be able to protect herself when he was out working the far pastures. She was a surprisingly good shot, and his pride in her accomplishment warmed her from the inside out. They developed routines that felt sacred. Every evening, they would sit on the porch together, sometimes talking, sometimes simply existing in comfortable silence. Samuel would tell her about his day, the challenges he faced with the cattle or repairs that needed doing, and she would share her own small victories, a successful batch of bread, a new plant sprouting in the garden, progress on a quilt she was making. One night, about a month after their wedding, a storm rolled in over the mountains. Thunder boomed across the valley and lightning split the sky. The cattle grew restless, and Samuel had to go out to make sure they did not break through the fence in their panic. "Stay inside," he told Natalie, pulling on his oilskin coat. "I will be back as soon as I can." But an hour passed, then two, and Samuel did not return. The storm grew worse, rain lashing the windows and wind howling around the corners of the house. Natalie tried to remain calm, but fear gnawed at her stomach. What if something had happened? What if he was hurt? She could not just sit and wait. Pulling on her own coat and boots, she lit a lantern and ventured out into the storm. The rain was so heavy she could barely see, and mud sucked at her feet with every step. She made her way toward the pasture, calling Samuel's name over the roar of the storm. Finally, she saw light in the distance, another lantern bobbing near the fence line. Relief flooded through her and she ran forward, nearly slipping in the mud. "Samuel," he turned, and even through the rain she could see his shock. "Natalie, what are you doing out here? I told you to stay inside. You were gone too long. I was worried." She reached him, grabbing his arm. "Are you all right?" "I am fine, but you should not have come out in this." His anger was born of fear. She could see that, but it still stung. "I am your wife, not a child to be ordered about," she said sharply, raising her voice to be heard over the storm. "When you are in danger, I will not sit safely inside and do nothing." Samuel stared at her for a moment, water streaming down his face. Then, impossibly, he laughed. "You are absolutely right. I am sorry. I should know by now that you are not the type to wait patiently while others take all the risks." "Exactly," Natalie said, mollified. "Now, what needs to be done?" Together, they checked the fence and calmed the cattle as best they could. By the time they made it back to the house, both were soaked to the bone and shivering with cold. They peeled off their wet clothes and huddled together under blankets, sharing warmth and soft laughter at the ridiculousness of the situation. "We make a good team," Samuel said, kissing her forehead. "We do," Natalie agreed, and meant it with all her heart. As autumn deepened into winter, Natalie discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but Mrs. Henderson confirmed it when she came by for a visit and found Natalie being sick behind the house. "That is a familiar sight," the older woman said with a knowing smile. "How far along do you think you are?" "Maybe 2 months." Natalie wiped her mouth, embarrassed. "I have not told Samuel yet. I wanted to be sure." "Well, you can be sure now. That man is going to be over the moon." Natalie told him that night over dinner. She had planned a whole speech, but in the end she just blurted it out. "Samuel, I am going to have a baby." He dropped his fork, staring at her in stunned silence. Then his face split into the widest smile she had ever seen. "Truly, truly." He was around the table in an instant, pulling her up into his arms and spinning her around. "Natalie, this is incredible. We are going to be parents. Put me down before I get sick on you," she laughed. But she was crying too, overwhelmed with joy. That night, Samuel was impossibly gentle with her, treating her as if she were made of glass. It was sweet but also slightly frustrating, and she finally had to tell him that she was pregnant, not dying, and could still function normally. "I just want to take care of you," he said, looking sheepish. "You do take care of me every day, but I am strong, Samuel. I can handle this." Winter brought challenges. The weather turned bitter, and keeping the house warm became a constant battle. Samuel worked tirelessly to make sure they had enough firewood and that the cattle were provided for. There were days when the snow was so deep he could barely make it to the barn, and Natalie would watch anxiously from the window until she saw him returning. Her pregnancy progressed well, though she was often tired and sick in the mornings. Samuel was endlessly patient, bringing her ginger tea and holding her hair when she needed to be sick. He talked to her belly at night, telling their unborn child stories about the ranch and making grand plans for the future. "If it is a boy, we can teach him to ride as soon as he can walk," Samuel said one evening, his hand splayed across her swelling stomach. "And if it is a girl, we will teach her too. I want our children to be capable and strong like their mother." "Like both their parents," Natalie corrected. "You are the strongest person I know, Samuel." Christmas came, and the Hendersons invited them for dinner. It was a small gathering but warm and festive, and Natalie felt grateful for the community they were building here. Mrs. Henderson had knitted a tiny blanket for the baby, and Natalie cried when she unwrapped it, overwhelmed by the kindness. As the new year began, 1878 arrived with clear skies and cautious optimism. Samuel had plans to expand the herd in the spring, and Natalie was already preparing the small spare room to be a nursery. She sewed tiny clothes by lamplight, amazed that she would soon have a baby small enough to fit into them. In late January, a blizzard struck with terrifying intensity. It came on suddenly, the sky turning dark in the middle of the afternoon. Samuel had been out checking the fence line and barely made it back before the full force of the storm hit. For 3 days, they were trapped inside as snow piled up against the house and wind screamed around the eaves. On the second day, they heard a faint sound over the storm, something that might have been a voice calling for help. Samuel went to the window, peering out into the white chaos. "Someone is out there," he said grimly. "You cannot go out in this," Natalie protested. "You will get lost and freeze to death." "If someone is out there, they will definitely freeze to death if I do not help them." He was already pulling on layers of clothing, wrapping himself as warmly as possible. Natalie wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. She helped him tie a rope around his waist, securing the other end to the porch railing so he could find his way back, and watched with her heart in her throat as he disappeared into the blizzard. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Natalie stood at the door, one hand on the rope, the other on her swollen belly, praying harder than she had ever prayed in her life. Finally, she felt movement on the rope, a signal to pull. She hauled with all her strength, and Samuel emerged from the white, half carrying, half dragging a young man who looked barely conscious. Together, they got him inside and shut out the storm. The stranger was probably in his early 20s, Mexican, frozen nearly solid and babbling in Spanish. They stripped off his wet clothes and wrapped him in blankets, settling him by the fire while Natalie prepared warm broth. It took several hours, but slowly, the young man recovered enough to speak coherently. His name was Diego Martinez, and he had been traveling to meet his brother in Sacramento when his horse had bolted during the storm. He had been wandering in the snow for hours, certain he was going to die when he saw the light from their window. "I owe you my life," he said to Samuel, his accent thick but his English clear. "I thought I was already a dead man." "You would have done the same for us," Samuel said simply. They kept Diego with them until the storm passed, and in those 3 days Natalie learned his story. He was 23, the youngest of 6 children, traveling north to help his brother with a freight business. He was charming and grateful, insisting on helping with every chore despite his still recovering state. When the storm finally broke, Samuel took Diego into town to arrange his passage to Sacramento. But before he left, Diego pressed a small silver cross into Natalie's hand. "My mother gave this to me for protection," he said. "Please take it. May it keep you and your child safe." Natalie was moved to tears. "I cannot take something so precious. You saved my life. It is a small thing in return." After Diego departed, life returned to its normal rhythms. February gave way to March, and the land began to thaw. Natalie grew larger and more uncomfortable, but also more excited. The baby kicked frequently now, and Samuel would spend hours with his hand on her stomach, marveling at every movement. In early April, Natalie's labor began on a warm afternoon. Mrs. Henderson had agreed to attend the birth, and Samuel rode like a madman to fetch her. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next morning. Samuel stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and offering encouragement even when she cursed him for putting her in this situation. Finally, as the sun rose over the mountains, their son came into the world with a lusty cry. Samuel wept openly as Mrs. Henderson placed the baby in his arms, and Natalie, exhausted but exhilarated, watched the two most important people in her world with a heart so full she thought it might burst. "He is perfect," Samuel whispered, carefully placing their son in Natalie's arms, "just like his mother." They named him Daniel, after Natalie's father. He had a shock of dark hair and blue eyes that would eventually turn brown, and from the first moment, he had both his parents wrapped completely around his tiny fingers. The first months of Daniel's life were exhausting but wonderful. Natalie had never known it was possible to love something so fiercely or to be so constantly tired. Samuel was an involved father, waking in the night to help with feedings, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor when Daniel would not settle. They were partners in this as they were in everything, and Natalie fell even more in love with her husband watching him care for their son. Summer brought good fortune. The cattle did well, and Samuel was able to sell several head for excellent prices. They used the money to make improvements to the ranch, adding on to the house and building a better barn. Samuel hired a hand named Tom to help with the heavy work, a young man of 19 who was eager to learn and respectful. One afternoon in August, a familiar face appeared at their door. Diego Martinez stood on their porch, grinning widely, with a pretty young woman beside him. "I had to come back and thank you properly," Diego said, embracing Samuel like a brother, "and to introduce you to my fiancée, Rosa. We are getting married in Sacramento next month, and we wanted to invite you to the wedding." It was too far to travel with a young baby, but Natalie insisted they send a gift, a beautiful quilt she had made. Diego and Rosa stayed for dinner, and it was a joyful evening filled with laughter and stories. Before they left, Diego held Daniel carefully, as if the baby were made of precious glass. "You have a beautiful family," he said to Samuel and Natalie. "I am honored to know you both." As Daniel grew, the ranch prospered. Samuel's reputation as a fair man and a skilled rancher spread, and he began buying more land, gradually expanding their holdings. Natalie found her place in the community, helping organize a school for the children in the area and becoming known for her kindness and practical nature. When Daniel was 2, Natalie discovered she was pregnant again. This time, she recognized the signs immediately and told Samuel while they were out riding, checking fence lines together while Tom watched Daniel back at the house. Again, Samuel's face lit up with joy. "Already? Are you complaining?" she teased. "Absolutely not. I want a dozen children with you if we are so blessed." Their daughter, Emma, arrived the following spring, and she was as different from Daniel as night from day. Where Daniel had been a calm baby, Emma was fierce and demanding, letting her needs be known loudly and frequently. Natalie joked that she would probably run the ranch someday, and Samuel did not disagree. The years passed in a blur of happiness. Daniel grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved the horses and followed his father everywhere. Emma was indeed fierce, climbing trees and refusing to wear dresses, insisting on helping with ranch work from the time she could walk. A third child, another son they named Thomas after Samuel's late father, arrived when Emma was 3. Through it all, Samuel and Natalie's love only deepened. They still sat on the porch every evening when they could, talking about their day or simply being together in comfortable silence. Samuel still looked at her sometimes with that same wonder he had shown when she first stepped off the stagecoach, as if he could not quite believe his good fortune. "Do you ever regret it?" Natalie asked him one evening when the children were asleep and the stars were bright overhead. "Answering that advertisement, taking a chance on a stranger?" "Never," Samuel said without hesitation. "You are the best decision I ever made. Coming here, building this ranch, all of it was leading me to you. I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Even the month you waited for my response to your first letter," he laughed. "Even that, though it was torture. I wrote and rewrote that letter 100 times, trying to find the right words to convince you to give me a chance. You had me at seeking a partner for a shared life," Natalie admitted. "Everyone else's advertisements were so impersonal, listing requirements like shopping for goods. But you were looking for a partner, not just a wife. That was what I needed to hear." "It was what I needed too," Samuel said, pulling her close. "I did not want someone to cook and clean for me. I could do those things myself. I wanted someone to share the burden and the joy, someone to build something meaningful with. I wanted you, even before I knew you existed." In 1885, when Daniel was 7, Emma 5, and Thomas 2, they added a final member to their family, another daughter they named Grace. She was a surprise, arriving when Natalie thought they were done having children, but she was welcomed with joy. By then, the ranch had grown substantially. Samuel employed 3 full-time hands and had become one of the most respected ranchers in the region. The house had been expanded twice, growing from its original 2 rooms to a comfortable home with 6 bedrooms and a proper parlor. The barn was huge and well-maintained, and the cattle that grazed their land numbered in the hundreds. But despite their success and prosperity, Samuel and Natalie never forgot their humble beginnings. They helped newcomers get established, offering advice and assistance. They supported the school and the church, believing strongly in the importance of community. And they always made time for each other, for the love that had brought them together and sustained them through every challenge. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Samuel surprised Natalie with a trip back to Sierra City, leaving the children with the Hendersons for the night. They checked into the small hotel, a luxury they had never indulged in before, and Samuel took her to dinner at the nicest restaurant the town offered. 10 years, he marveled over dessert. "It feels like both forever and no time at all." "I know what you mean," Natalie said, squeezing his hand across the table. "Sometimes I still feel like that nervous woman stepping off the stagecoach, terrified you would not want me." "I fell in love with you the moment I saw you," Samuel said. "But I had already been in love with your words, your thoughts, your heart. Meeting you in person just confirmed what I already knew." "That we were meant to be together," Natalie finished. "Exactly." Later in their hotel room, Samuel pulled out a packet of letters, worn and faded but carefully preserved. "I kept every letter you sent me," he said. "Sometimes when I am having a difficult day, I read them again and remember how lucky I am." Natalie felt tears sting her eyes. "I kept yours too. They are in a box under our bed. I thought maybe someday, when the children are grown, we can read them together and remember how all this started. With words on paper, Samuel said softly, and hearts brave enough to hope. They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity mixed with the passion that had never dimmed between them. And in the morning, they returned to the ranch and their children, to the life they had built together from nothing but faith and love. The years continued to pass. Daniel grew into a young man who shared his father's love for the land and his mother's thoughtful nature. At 18, he began courting the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a sensible girl named Margaret who fit into their family as if she had always belonged. Emma, at 16, showed no interest in courting, too busy helping run the ranch and making plans to buy her own land someday. Thomas, at 13, had his father's skill with horses and could break a wild colt with patience and kindness. And Grace, at 10, was the family peacemaker, always finding ways to smooth over conflicts and bring everyone together. Samuel and Natalie watched their children grow with pride and occasional wistfulness. The house that had once felt too big for two now sometimes felt too small for six, but neither of them would have changed a thing. One evening in the summer of 1892, 15 years after Natalie had arrived in Sierra City, she and Samuel sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple. It had become their favorite time of day, a moment of peace after the bustle of family life. "Do you remember what you wrote in your third letter to me?" Natalie asked, her head resting on Samuel's shoulder. "I wrote many things. You will have to be more specific." "You wrote that you hoped to find someone who would look at the mountains with you and see not just stone and trees, but possibility. Someone who would understand that you were not just building a ranch but a legacy." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "I remember. I almost did not include that part. I thought it might sound too grand, too presumptuous." "It was what convinced me to come," Natalie said, "because I wanted that too. I wanted to build something that mattered, something that would last beyond us. And we did, Samuel. Look at what we have created." He looked around at the ranch, at the sturdy buildings and healthy cattle. At the garden, Natalie had expanded over the years until it provided vegetables for half the county. But mostly, he looked at the house where their children were, Daniel in the barn finishing evening chores, Emma mending tack on the porch steps, Thomas and Grace playing some elaborate game in the yard. "We did," he agreed. "But the ranch is not the legacy I am most proud of, Natalie. It is them. It is us. It is the family we made and the love we built it on. That is what will last." Natalie felt tears on her cheeks, the happy kind that came from a heart too full to contain all its joy. "I love you, Samuel Ellis. I loved you from your letters. I loved you at first sight, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond. And I love you, Natalie Ellis. You took a chance on a lonely rancher and his wild dreams, and you made every single one of them come true." They sat together as the sun sank below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and purple. The same colors Samuel had described in his letters, the same beauty he had promised she would find if she came west to join him. But the real beauty, they both knew, was not in the landscape but in the life they had built together, brick by brick, day by day, letter by letter, until it was something strong enough to weather any storm. Inside the house, the children called that dinner was ready, and Samuel and Natalie rose together, hand in hand, to join their family. The mail-order bride who had arrived already in love, and the rancher who had felt the same for months, had created something miraculous, not just surviving but thriving in the rugged beauty of the West. Their story would be told for generations, how Samuel and Natalie met through letters, fell in love with words, and built an empire on faith. Their grandchildren would read those old, faded letters and marvel at the courage it took, her willingness to cross a continent for an unknown man, his vulnerability in pouring his heart onto paper for a stranger. But more than courage or vulnerability, what shone through every word of those letters was hope. Hope that somewhere out there the right person existed. Hope that love could grow from seeds planted on paper. Hope that a shared dream could become a shared reality. And in the end, that hope had been rewarded 1,000 times over. Samuel and Natalie had found what so many people spend their whole lives seeking: a true partnership, a genuine love, a home not just in a place but in each other's hearts. As they gathered around the dinner table that night, their children's voices rising in laughter and argument and affection, Samuel caught Natalie's eye across the chaos and smiled. She smiled back, and in that moment, no words were needed. They had said everything that mattered in those letters so long ago, and they had spent every day since proving those words true. The ranch prospered for many years to come. Daniel eventually took over the main operation, running it with the same careful stewardship his father had shown. He married Margaret in a beautiful ceremony, and they gave Samuel and Natalie their first grandchildren, twin boys who were as wild as the wind. Emma did buy her own land eventually, a smaller spread on the other side of the valley, and proved that a woman could run a successful ranch just as well as any man. Thomas went into horse breeding and became known throughout California for producing the finest stock in the region. And Grace, sweet Grace, became a teacher, educating the next generation of children in Sierra City, and carrying on her mother's belief in the power of words and learning. Samuel and Natalie grew old together, their hair turning silver, their faces weathering like the landscape around them. But their love never aged. It remained as fresh and vital at 60 as it had been at 22 and 26, sustained by mutual respect, genuine affection, and the memory of those letters that had started it all. When Samuel was 70, he suffered a fall from a horse and was bedridden for several weeks. Natalie barely left his side, reading to him, talking to him, holding his hand through the pain. He recovered, but the incident reminded them both that their time was not infinite. "I want you to know," Samuel said one night as they lay in bed, his head on her shoulder in a reversal of their usual positions, "that loving you has been the greatest adventure of my life. Greater than coming west, greater than building the ranch, greater than anything else I have ever done or will do." "We still have time," Natalie whispered, though she knew what he was really saying. "We have years yet, Samuel. I know. But whenever that time comes, whether it is tomorrow or 20 years from now, I want you to remember that every single day with you was a gift. I would not trade one moment of our life together for all the gold in California." "Neither would I," Natalie said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. But fate was kinder than they feared. Samuel and Natalie lived to see all their children married, to hold a dozen grandchildren, to celebrate their 40th wedding anniversary surrounded by 3 generations of family they had created. On a warm September evening in 1917, 40 years almost to the day after Natalie had arrived in Sierra City, they sat on their porch one last time. Samuel was 87 now, Natalie 82, and both were weary in the way that comes from a long life well lived. Their children had tried to convince them to retire to town, to take it easy, but neither could bear to leave the ranch, the place where they had built their life together. "You remember that first day?" Samuel asked, his voice thin but clear. "When you stepped off that stagecoach and I thought my heart would stop from nerves." "I remember everything," Natalie said, squeezing his hand. His fingers were gnarled with arthritis now, but his grip was still warm and sure. I remember being so scared and so hopeful all at once. I remember seeing you and knowing that I had made the right choice. Best choice I ever made was placing that advertisement, Samuel said. And the luckiest day of my life was when you answered it. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the mountains purple one more time. In the distance, they could hear their great-grandchildren playing, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. The ranch stretched out before them, prosperous and thriving, a testament to all they had built. "We did good, did we not?" Samuel asked softly. "We did better than good," Natalie replied. "We created something beautiful." As darkness fell and the stars began to emerge, Samuel and Natalie remained on their porch, hands clasped, hearts entwined as they had been for 40 years. They had started with nothing but letters and hope, and they had built an empire of love that would endure long after they were gone. Samuel passed peacefully in his sleep. 2 weeks later, Natalie beside him as she had been for 40 years. She held his hand as he took his last breath, and though her heart broke, she also felt a deep gratitude. They had been given so much time, so much love, so much life together. Natalie lived another 3 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, telling stories of the early days and making sure the legacy she and Samuel had built would continue. She kept his letters in a box by her bed, and sometimes, late at night, she would take them out and read them by lamplight, hearing his voice in every carefully chosen word. When Natalie's time came, she went peacefully, a smile on her face. Her children found her in her favorite chair on the porch, Samuel's letters scattered around her, the last one still clutched in her hand. It was the first letter he had ever sent her, the one where he had written about seeking a partner for a shared life, and the ink was smudged where her tears had fallen on it one last time. They buried her next to Samuel on a hill overlooking the ranch, and the entire county turned out for the funeral. Person after person stood and told stories of Samuel and Natalie's kindness, their generosity, their love. The minister spoke of how rare and precious it was to see a love like theirs, one that had endured every test and emerged stronger. But the most moving tribute came from Emma, their fierce daughter who was now a grandmother herself. She stood beside her parents' graves and read from the letters, her voice strong despite her tears. "My father wrote to my mother before they ever met, seeking a partner for a shared life. And that is what they had every single day for 40 years. Not a perfect life, not an easy life, but a shared one. They built this ranch together. They raised us together. They faced every joy and every sorrow together. And in doing so, they showed all of us what love really means, not just passion or romance, though they had plenty of both, but partnership, respect, commitment, and choosing each other every single day." She folded the letter carefully and placed it on her mother's grave. "We are all here because 2 people were brave enough to risk their hearts on a few words written on paper. Because a woman in Boston decided to answer an advertisement from a man in California. Because they both believed that love was possible, even across the distance, even without certainty. And they were right." The family gathered on the ranch that night, as they had so many times before, filling the house with voices and laughter and tears. They told stories about Samuel and Natalie, about the early struggles and later triumphs, about the love that had been the foundation of everything. Daniel, now 64 and still running the ranch with his sons, raised a glass. "To Samuel and Natalie Ellis, who proved that the greatest adventures start with the courage to hope and the willingness to risk everything for love." To Samuel and Natalie, everyone echoed, and the mountains seemed to echo it back. Years later, the letters Samuel and Natalie had exchanged were donated to the California Historical Society, where they became a beloved example of frontier correspondence and the mail-order bride phenomenon that helped settle the West. Scholars studied them. Historians referenced them, but mostly, people read them and felt their hearts warm at the genuine affection and vulnerability contained in those carefully written words. The ranch itself stayed in the family, passed down through generations, each one adding their own chapter to the story Samuel and Natalie had begun. The house was eventually expanded and modernized, but the original 2 rooms were preserved exactly as they had been, a museum to the couple who had started it all. And on warm September evenings, when the sun set and painted the mountains purple, family members would sometimes sit on that old porch and feel the presence of Samuel and Natalie, the mail-order bride and the rancher who had loved her from letters, who had built an empire on hope and faith, and whose love story had become legend. Their story was one of courage and vulnerability, of taking chances and believing in possibilities. It was a reminder that love does not always follow a logical path, that sometimes the greatest relationships start in the most unexpected ways, and that words on paper can carry the weight of the human heart. Samuel had sought a partner for a shared life, and Natalie had answered that call. Together, they had created something that transcended the limitations of their time and place, a love that was genuine and deep, a partnership that was equal and respectful, a legacy that would endure for generations. In the end, that was the true magic of their story. Not that it was a fairy tale, because it was not. There had been struggles and hardships, disagreements and difficulties, lean years and hard times. But through it all, they had chosen each other, supported each other, loved each other with a constancy that never wavered. The mail-order bride who had arrived already in love, and the rancher who had felt the same for months, had found what they were seeking. Not just a marriage or a partnership, but a true joining of souls, a love that made them both more than they could have been alone. And if you visited the Ellis Ranch on a September evening, when the sun painted the mountains purple, and the breeze carried the scent of sage and wildflowers, you might almost hear their voices on the porch. Samuel reading aloud from a book, while Natalie worked on her endless quilting, both of them simply enjoying being together in the peaceful comfort of a love that had withstood every test time could throw at it. Their love story began with letters, grew through faith and hope, was tested by hardship and challenge, and ultimately triumphed because 2 people decided that what they had found was worth fighting for, worth building on, worth dedicating their lives to preserving and nurturing. It was a love story for the ages, simple in its beginning but profound in its impact. And it all started with a mail-order bride who stepped off a stage-coach already in love, and a rancher who had been counting the days until her arrival. His heart already given to a woman he had known only through carefully written words on carefully folded paper. That was the legacy Samuel and Natalie left behind. Not just the ranch or the family or the material success, but the proof that love can bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, that courage and hope can create miracles, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with nothing more than words on paper and the faith to believe in them. They showed everyone who knew them that true partnership was possible, that love could be both passionate and comfortable, exciting and stable, and that choosing each other every single day was the secret to a life well lived. Their story became part of the land itself, woven into the fabric of Sierra City and the surrounding valleys, an inspiration to anyone who heard it, and a reminder that the best things in life are worth taking risks for.